We can classify species into two general categories called K and R selection or K and R reproductive strategies. The K and R species, when we look at them, they're very sort of independent, but we don't want to forget the idea that you can actually have some overlapping of some of those characteristics where maybe they have some characteristics as an R selected species and some as a K. And so I'll show you on the Venn diagram at the bottom here what I mean after I've gone through all of the sort of specifics as to how we would classify each of these organisms. So K-selected species would be things like, humans or grizzly bears. They live in predictable and stable environments, and with that tend to have S-shaped growth curves because those predictable environments usually allow that population to reach a carrying capacity in which dynamic equilibrium was going to form right at the carrying capacity and kind of stabilizes that environment. Those organisms tend to be long-lived, so they have long lifespans, stable population sizes, and the things that really are going to affect their mortality are density-dependent factors, other than age. So those things that we talked about in the previous video, intraspecific competition, predation, pathogens, those things that are going to be affected when the population becomes more dense. And with that, kind of linking in, is that competition is intense between species that are K-selected. So they also tend to have multiple reproductive events that begin later in life. So, when we think later in life for humans, it would be the time of which menstruation would happen for a female. But like a polar bear, they're usually fertile in around 2 or 3 years of age. That is still considered later in life compared to something like a mosquito who can reproduce right away once they're born. When they take care of their young, they usually have prolonged care of their young. So you can think of a mother bear with her cubs, if you've ever seen one on the side of the highway. They usually have more modest numbers of offspring, so it's not an unreasonable population burst, and they tend to have a larger body size. They're physically larger species. Our selected species, on the other hand, they exploit rapidly changing environments, are more short-lived. Their population size is very variable, and they have density-independent mortality. And a good example would be mosquitoes. So if there's a nice warm spring and there's been some rain and there's some puddles in some of the creeks, you've got mosquito larvae that are starting to develop, and those larvae develop and mosquitoes form. And then, in the weather that we experience here in central Alberta, you have sometimes snowfalls and freezing in that same month. And so then they all die. And so that's sort of exhibiting the fact that they're density independent, whereas, the grizzly bears aren't going to die from that snowfall, but something like the mosquitoes would, because they're just a little bit more of an unstable type of a species. They usually have a single reproductive event and don't tend to have any offspring after. They don't really care for their young. So when a mosquito's born, it goes off and does its own thing. They usually have high numbers of offspring. With that's that density independent mortality and this really increase in offspring, like a very high numbers of offspring. You tend to get J-shaped population curves with our selected species, and they tend to be organisms that have a smaller body size. So we can use a Venn diagram to show comparisons between our selected strategies and K-selected strategies in organisms. And while, like the grizzly bear, the human probably sit, very much in this K-selected side. Your mosquitoes probably sit very nicely in this R-selected side. But let's look at something like a sea turtle. A sea turtle lays, let's say, 82 eggs a sitting, and they live about 65 years. So they have a K-selected trait of having a long life, but a highly fertile sort of reproduction rate. So there are some that can sit in the middle when we're talking about that. When we talk about population interactions, there are terms that you've probably heard over the years. You've talked about them many times. Very generally speaking, we call them symbiosis. And the symbiosis is just interactions between two species that maintain a close relationship. They're, maybe in the same community, for example. And there's three types of symbiosis that we talk about: parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. Parasitism is where there's an interaction that's beneficial to one species and harmful and not necessarily fatal to the other. And we say not necessarily fatal because sometimes we can consider it not being fatal, if it is fatal, to be maybe a predator-prey or like a plant predation, for example, where an organism eats the roots of the plant and the plant dies rather than just feeding off of a plant. So we want to just be careful with parasitism that it's usually just a harmful interaction, and that interaction can sometimes cause death. So an example of that would be the malaria parasite. So in the case of the malaria parasite, the parasite benefits because it gets to use the blood as a host, right? So the parasite will benefit, and then the human or the host is harmed. Okay, it's just the host is allowing that parasite to live, and the parasite gets to feed off of the host. Mutualism is where you have an interaction that's beneficial to both species. An example of that could be E. coli in the human gut. And it's beneficial to E. coli because they get to feed off of waste. And it's beneficial to humans as long as it's not out of control, because it allows for the production of vitamins. And in particular, E. coli produces vitamin K, which then we reabsorb, and that's how we get that vitamin. Commensalism is where you have an interaction that is beneficial to one species, but it doesn't have an effect on the other species. And the good example of this one is the caribou and the Arctic fox. So the caribou has really long legs. And so the caribou can walk through the snow, through that deep snow, creating a path. And then 2 days later, if it hasn't snowed, the Arctic fox, who's a lot shorter than the caribou, the Arctic fox can use that path for travel or to find food. There could be little holes in the ground. They could smell some of the burrowing animals and maybe get some food. And the caribou was unaffected by it. Didn't even realize that the fox, was going to be using that path 2 days from now. Other general types of interactions that we need to understand are just general interspecific competition. So like I said in the other video, intra means within, inter means between species. And when we look at the situation between two species, if they have overlapping niches or roles in their community, that's where you're going to find the strongest competition. And so Gauss was a person who came up with the principle of competitive exclusion, that it doesn't matter if they share the same niche. You have two organisms that share the same niche, they are going to fight until one ends up having to leave or becomes extinct. And the example that he used is where he took bacteria that were grown separately and then grew them together. So when he grew them separately, these bacteria both had nice growth rates, kept feeding them. They both fed just fine, and they have the same food source. But when he put them in the same culture, one bacteria did significantly better than the other. The other one essentially became extinct. And that's because they share the same niche, and so they're going to compete with one another. The second other type of interaction is a producer-consumer reaction, which is pretty simple, and we've been talking about this for many years in science, and that's just where the producer is the plant or something that can produce its own food, and then the consumer is the organism that eats the plant. Predation is the last concept in terms of relationships between organisms, and predation always has this sort of offset cyclical graph, where as the predator density goes down, the prey population goes up because there's less predators eating the prey. But then as the prey population goes up, there's more prey for the predators to eat. Now the predators can access more prey, and so they're eating, they're feeding well, they're reproducing, their population goes up, which then is going to bring that prey population down because now you have more predators, and you get this offset cycle. And one good example that was studied for almost 100 years was the snowshoe and hare relationship in northern Canada. And it was done really all by anecdotal evidence. And you can see that there's sort of that natural offset relationship. And it was done just by, watching the land and noticing, periods of years, right? So 2 or 3 years at a time where there were way more lynx than there were hares, or then way more hares than there were lynx. And a summary of interactions is below. So let's not forget there's also defense mechanisms that organisms use. They can use defense mechanisms like scents, like a skunk, thorns, like a rose bush, and camouflage to hide themselves. So it's not something that's covered very deeply in Bio30, but just having that understanding that organisms do try to protect themselves. The last concept is the idea of succession. So as a community starts, it's going to grow into what we call a climax community. So if you think of a community where nothing has existed before, such as where a glacier has retracted and there's land there that hasn't had anything grow on it before, the first thing that's going to colonize that area are going to be some mosses. And those mosses or lichens, they don't need a root system, so they can sit on the surface and they can start doing their thing in terms of taking in the carbon dioxide from the air, attracting pollinators, and you're bringing more species into that environment. So this idea of succession is this change over time of a community as it becomes what we call a climax community. The two general types of succession are primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is the one I'm explaining in terms of the glacier, or an area where there hasn't been any land before or anything growing on that land before. So new land formed from a volcanic eruption is a good example as well. You're usually starting with rock or something that is not soil yet. And it takes a really long time for colonizers to then be established, which then is going to bring more pioneers, which is then going to bring more herbaceous plants, and with that, the organisms as well. We tend to also move from sort of like a heavily favored R-selected environment to a little bit of an R, and then an R and a K selected environment as you move through succession. Secondary succession occurs where you've already had something there, but it's been destroyed. So you think of a forest fire. So there was already a climax community, but it was destroyed by fire and it's starting again. And the key there is that soil is already present. And so it doesn't take as long to break down that rock to then allow seeds and vascular plants to grow in it. The first plants that go to or that start to grow in a new community are called the pioneer species, and any of their associated species as well. So your colonizers, your pioneers. Your colonizers really are mostly the things that don't need a root system, like lichens and mosses. And then you're moving into your pioneers, like grasses and ferns, very, very simple vascular systems. And the productivity of the environment is going to increase as you move to the climax community. The biomass is going to increase as you move to the climax community. And in theory, you'll be hitting the carrying capacity of a community at that point. It takes many more years for a community to undergo primary succession than it does secondary succession.